Good afternoon. Thank you very much for giving me a few minutes. I've been testified before you about a month ago, and I want to commend you on holding this hearing and delving so deeply into the facts that so many other people are avoiding and pretending didn't exist. I sat and listened to a good deal of the testimony, but before I stood here, and I can't imagine that people are ignoring it. Your Secretary of State's office last night and today said this was the cleanest election in history or the purest election in history. He must be living on some other planet or drinking something that affects his senses, because it's just the opposite. This is probably the worst situation of voter fraud we've ever had in this country. Georgia is one example of it. You know there are other examples of it: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, just to name a few. And in your case, you have documentary evidence of it. This is, whatever the result, this election is going to live in history. This is going to be the election that will be the dirtiest election, the most crooked election, the most manipulated election in American history, because there are more facts to be gathered, even more than we have been able to gather in the month and a half we've had to investigate it. It's going to be a much greater dimension than we already know, and it's going to involve international connections, which means people are going to look back on this and they're going to say, what did you do about it? I mean, a year from now and 2 years from now, people are going to look back on it and say, what did you do about the fraud? Did you just sit by and let it happen? And Georgia is going to be at the center of it, because you have what I call the Zapruder film, I don't know if everybody remembers the Zapruder film, but it was the film of the Kennedy assassination that demonstrated the inadequacies of the Warren Commission that live in infamy now. Well, you don't want to live in infamy. You want to live in heroism. And you want to live in a situation where you do something about it, and you're not cowered by the media, by big tech, big corporations, and unfortunately the crooked leadership of the Democrat Party, because this was not an accident. This was organized. What happened here in this state is precisely the same thing that happened in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Arizona, and some of it happened at exactly the same time, particularly that phony situation at the Fulton County Center, which you have documented. If you can watch that and not realize that this was a major situation of voter fraud, then you're a fool or a liar. It's quite obvious that they are counting ballots illegally. The law of this state says that the counting of ballots has to be public, that it has to be allow inspectors, it has to allow both sides to have a chance to observe it. I mean, the law of every state just about requires that. Well, you can see the people being thrown out. You can see them being thrown out. You can see them checking all around, and then in a very, very suspicious way, counting ballots so fast they couldn't possibly look at the signatures. They couldn't possibly look at the ballots. And then you can see them counting the ballots more than once, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. You would have to be a moron not to realize that that's voter fraud. And if you just take a look at the ballots counted during that period of time, and you deduct that number of ballots from Fulton County, the winner of this election in Georgia is President Trump, not Joe Biden. And that'll be provable a year from now, and 2 years from now, and 10 years from now. And it's really a disservice to the people of your state. It leaves a stigma that you shouldn't have. They're going to ask, you can be sure, because this is going to continue unless we stop it. It's going to continue, the misuse of the mail-in ballot, all the terrible things that were predicted as to what would happen if you went to some kind of major mail-in ballot system. Predictions made by Secretary Baker, President Carter, Justice Souter, and scholars, that the minute you have mail-in ballots, you're going to have major fraud. 76% of European countries do not allow mail-in ballots. for the very reason that they invite fraud. Well, we just proved it to the world. Sure, it invites fraud, plenty of fraud. The people in Fulton County were instructed not to look at signatures. They were instructed to do that, and you have testimony to that effect. Not only do you have testimony to that effect, you have film that shows you them not looking at the signature, doing this. It's going to happen again. Well, it's not just going to happen again. It's happening right now as I speak in the election that's going on. The same fraud that went on in the prior election is going on right now with the mail-in ballots because of the unlawful, unconstitutional consent decree that your Secretary of State, I guess, entered into. I don't know what's wrong with him, but that consent decree usurps your power as a state legislature. You're supposed to make those changes. The Constitution gives the authority to you. The Constitution also says the buck stops here, and the buck stops with the state legislature. You're responsible for those numbers that have been submitted to Washington. Is there anybody that believes that Georgia submitted the right number of votes to Washington? Is there anybody that would like to put their name on an affidavit that that's true and correct and take a risk of going to jail? As a lawyer, I would instruct you not to do that, because there's not a person in Georgia or a person in the United States that believes that those numbers are correct. If you look at that one recording, that one tape, you know they're not correct. Or if you look at the fact that you had 2,560 felons vote. You had 15,700 people vote in Georgia who had changed their address before the election. You had 40,000 people fail to re-register before they voted. You had 10,315 people that we can determine from obituaries were dead when they voted. That's pretty tough to do, to vote when you're dead. So right away, that number you submitted to Washington is a lie. It's not true. It's false. Minus 10,000 dead people. Those are the number of dead people we were able to figure out by looking at obituaries, because your Secretary of State is engaged in what I consider an unlawful cover-up. He won't let us look at records. If the Dominion machines are what we say they are, and we've tested the Dominion machines in Michigan, those machines are like Swiss cheese. You can invade them, you can get in them, you can change the vote, you can fractionalize the vote. Why would you ever fractionalize a vote? There's not such a thing as half a vote or a quarter of a vote. Why would you have an election machine where you can change the vote? The liars who run Dominion have said you can't change the vote. Read the manual. Read their manual. Their manual says you can change the vote. Why should you be allowed to change a vote in a voting machine? Once that vote goes in there, that's it. You shouldn't be able to change it. You shouldn't be able to move it from Trump to Biden or from Biden to Trump. Well, you can do that in the Dominion machine. Our people have inspected 22 Dominion machines. We've submitted affidavits from, and they're all ex-military people who did this work for the NSA and for the United States government. Every time they would count in the machine, they would get a different count. They were able to move votes, massive number of votes, from one side to the other. They caught, in this county, 6,000 votes having been moved from Trump to Biden, which had to be reversed. But those are the only machines we've ever gotten to look at. If 22 machines move 6,000 votes, how many machines do you have here? How many votes do you think they moved? And why is it that the Secretary of State won't allow us to examine them? If he's so sure this was the cleanest election in history, let us examine the machines. We'll find out really fast. We'll find out really fast if this was the cleanest election in history or the biggest scandal in terms of voting in the history of our country. We'll find out in 2 days. Or we can go get the gentleman you had before, the gentleman you had here before who can examine the ballots. He can tell you in a day. He can find out, were there illegal ballots submitted? He can tell you whether it's an official ballot of the state of Georgia or one made up in a garage somewhere so they could plug in an extra 30 or 40,000 Biden votes. He can tell you that definitively, scientifically. We can find out if it was the cleanest election in history or the biggest fraud in history. Who's stopping us? Your Secretary of State is stopping us. If he's so sure that it's the cleanest vote ever in history, then let us examine the ballots. Let us forensically examine the ballots. Let's not keep recounting the same crooked votes that we counted in the first place. The recount in Cobb County is a joke. It's an insult. Yeah, I mean, I can keep recounting the same phony votes over and over again, and I'll get the same result. Let us examine the ballots, said Mr. Secretary of State. Let us examine the machines. And why are you stopping us from doing that? Why are you stopping the people from Georgia to find out if these allegations, which are made now by numerous witnesses, I don't know how many witnesses you've had that have demonstrated fraud. Well, let's find out how extensive it was. It's easy to do. It'll take about 3-4 days. There's a scientific process to do it. And if you need evidence that this was a deliberate fraud, that's your best evidence. I mean, why would they stop the gentleman who testified earlier from examining ballots this morning, other than the fact that they know if he examines those ballots, he's going to pull out 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 ballots that were made up by the Democrat Party and submitted and put in during periods of time like what you saw on video. That's exactly what was happening. And if you look at the number of votes during that period of time, Biden gained 138,000 vote advantage during that period of time from those votes. You take that advantage away, who wins this state? Let me conclude by saying something that I find people resist, and maybe it's because we've never faced this before. Our founding fathers miraculously probably envisioned everything that would happen to us. They even envisioned this: a disputed election, cheating, stealing. And they made a choice. They made a choice of where to put the responsibility in a difficult situation like that. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution puts that responsibility right here in the state, in the legislatures of the several states. You are responsible for the selection of the electors, not the governor, not your Secretary of State who's covering up everything he can cover up, not anybody else, but you. It's your power. It doesn't come from the state constitution. It comes from the United States Constitution. You are not subjected to needing a special session. The governor has no right, really, to interfere in it. He has no right to call a special session or not call a special session. The Constitution has taken him out of the process. The Constitution put the power in the state legislature. So strong that you can take that power back right up to the last moment. You could take it back 2 minutes before the electoral votes are counted. Because ultimately it's your responsibility. You delegated it to them in the first place. And if you feel that they're exercising it improperly, it is your obligation to stop them from doing it. And you know they exercised it improperly. You know that. You've got so much evidence of it. There are 10 ways to demonstrate it. There are 10 ways to demonstrate that this election was stolen, that the votes were phony, that there were a lot of them, dead people, felons, phony ballots, phony mail-in ballots. How is it that in every single Republican county in this state, state senators ran ahead of the president by 4 to 6%? Every single one. Exactly the same, 4 to 6%. We know the president's favorability in this state. We know that, at least in a few of those cases, he's going to run ahead of the Republican senators. And it just so happens it's just in the states where they fixed the vote that happened. In other states, the president ran ahead of most Republican state senators. So I'm tired of demonstrating it. There are so many ways of demonstrating it. You know it. This is a question of courage. It's ultimately a question of courage. Do you have the courage to stand up to the obligation the Constitution of the United States put on you to save our people from fraud, to save the reputation of the state of Georgia from in history, certifying a phony vote that led to the wrong result in an election, which will be the verdict of history? Or do you have the courage to put up with what's going to happen if you in fact change that certification and do the right thing? You'll be attacked, you'll be pilloried, you'll be described in all sorts of horrible ways. But you'll wake up the next morning and look in the mirror and you'll be able to say, I did the right thing. And that's what you should be about in public office. Not worried about what people say, but what you did. And I'll tell you another thing. Your decision will stand the test of history, because this is going to prove to be even worse than it is now, and it's pretty bad. So I implore you, hold a session, take a vote, do the right thing, and forget the criticism. You know what the right thing to do is. You've seen the evidence. You know what the law is. And I implore you to do the right thing. Not necessarily for President Trump, although he is my client and your client, but now it really has become much bigger than that. For the American people, and so this stops right now. No more of this stuff in America. This is the stuff you do in a third world country. We let them get away with this, it can get much worse. And I can't say enough about your courage, you, Mr. Chairman, and the other members of your committee, in doing what a lot of others are afraid to do. And I thank you on behalf of my client and on behalf of the United States.